Hello everyone, a very good morning and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep. Welcome to the daily Hindu news analysis. So let's begin today's discussion by first looking at the articles that we are going to take up for the discussion. I have chosen 9 important articles from the Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper. We have 3 important columns for a detailed discussion and an analysis, and we have 6 more articles that are relevant for the prelims. So let's cover these articles one by one comprehensively to ensure that you don't have to go back and read the newspaper again. If you guys are liking the initiative, do support us by pressing the like button, share your comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. And also head to our Telegram channel as soon as the session ends, because we have a quiz on these topics which will help you revise these articles again. The link for the Telegram channel is also provided in the description box below. So with this, let's begin with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by first taking up this column from page number 9, where The Hindu carries an interview with 2 top former Indian diplomats regarding the relevance of United Nations. Now that the world has been ravaged by various conflicts, and we have seen that the United Nations has largely been ineffective in handling these geopolitical situations, the question does come up as to what is the UN doing? Why the United Nations is not effective in preventing conflicts and maintaining peace and stability. Of course, it's one of the primary objectives of the United Nations. I've seen even in class, many students raise the same question. Whenever we discuss the problems in, let's say, in Ukraine, or the problems in Afghanistan, the problems in West Asia, and the various conflicts going on around the world, one common question we always get is that what is the United Nations doing? Why isn't the UN preventing such wars? Or why isn't the UN mediating a ceasefire? Right? This question keeps coming up every now and then in international relations and geopolitics. So this key question is being addressed here by 2 top former Indian diplomats, Rakesh Sood and Vivek Kadju. I feel it's a very, very important topic as far as international relations is concerned. You can definitely expect a mains question on these lines as to why the UN is not effective in handling global conflicts. So let's look into this in detail by taking some inputs from the former Indian diplomats. And we'll also broaden the discussion. We'll bring in few additional points as well to make it a comprehensive discussion. So the context in which the topic is in news is because of the ongoing global conflicts. The latest terror attack that Hamas carried out against Israel on the 7th of October, right, was a brutal terror attack which has pushed Israel to retaliate with massive force. Israel also has used disproportionate force in its retaliation, and it has been relentlessly bombing civilian areas in Gaza Strip, thus triggering a humanitarian tragedy in the Gaza area. You also have the Russia-Ukraine conflict going on. It's almost been 2 years right now, close to 2 years. Then we have other conflicts going on across Africa. There is a civil war in Myanmar. We recently witnessed a conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia over the Nagorno-Karabakh region. So there are numerous conflicts going on in the last few months itself, and yet the UN is largely missing in action. So this is what leads us to the question, has the UN become toothless in ending wars? Right? So the writers agree, the expert panel and the writer of the column, they agree that the United Nations has become incapable of bringing about peace. That is the final conclusion that they are drawing. But we need to understand why. Why has UN become ineffective? To answer this question, we need to look at the background of the United Nations. The United Nations was established back in 1945 following the Second World War. One of its primary goals was to prevent another such global conflict. It was set up as a replacement to the erstwhile League of Nations, which had been created after the First World War. When the First World War came to an end through the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, that is when a global international organization had been set up, a global order had been created through League of Nations. And one of the primary responsibilities of League of Nations, which is like the predecessor of the UN, was to prevent conflicts, to address geopolitical tensions, provide for talks and negotiations between countries which are fighting against each other. But the League of Nations was a spectacular failure. In fact, in many ways, it not only failed to prevent the Second World War, but in many ways it contributed to the Second World War. Because the countries which won the First World War, led by Britain and France, they misused the League of Nations for their own self-interests. They inflicted a lot of humiliation on Germany through the League of Nations, which hurt the German pride and identity, which eventually became a root cause for the rise of the Nazi Party and Hitler's fascism. Hitler's right-wing fascism was largely built on the hurt German pride and identity, which was inflicted by following the defeat of the First World War. And League of Nations in a way was responsible for that. So in many ways, instead of preventing the Second World War, it in a way contributed to the Second World War. So League of Nations was seen as very ineffective. It was eventually disbanded in 1946 after the United Nations had been set up. So the UN was formed in 1945 after the Second World War as a replacement to the League of Nations. So one of the primary goals of the UN under the UN Charter, which had been adopted, was to prevent conflicts, to deal with wars, border disputes and tensions between countries and provide for peaceful solutions. That was the primary purpose of the United Nations. If you look at the UN Charter, you can come across the primary objectives of the UN, which has been clearly laid out. There are 5 primary objectives of the UN. The first one is to maintain international peace and security, and the second one is to promote human rights. These 2 objectives were added in the context of the world wars that we had witnessed. The 2 world wars had ravaged not just the European continent, but all across the world there was a lot of destruction. Right? Peace and stability had been affected, human rights had been compromised. There was a massive refugee crisis around the world. It was in this context that the UN was given the mandate to maintain international peace and security, which meant the UN was supposed to intervene in any conflicts, in any bilateral tensions, and scale down the tensions by providing for talks, by providing for peace and negotiations, and with the objective of protecting humanitarian law and promoting human rights. Apart from these 2 primary goals, it was also given the goal to foster socio-economic development. Because around the world, the focus was shifting towards welfare. The goal was to reconstruct the global economy, which had been destroyed by the world wars. There was also focus on protecting the environment for the first time, because the Industrial Revolution and the world wars had caused enormous pollution and damage to the environment. So tackling environmental challenges became an objective of the UN, and also providing humanitarian assistance to people in need, people who are affected by famines, disasters, wars and conflict, because the world was dealing with an unprecedented refugee crisis following the world wars. So if you look at all the objectives of the UN, they are directly inspired by the outcomes of the disastrous world wars. From maintaining peace and security to promoting human rights, promoting welfare, socio-economic growth, protecting the environment and providing humanitarian assistance. Right? All these goals of UN are directly inspired by the horrors caused by the world wars. So despite the stated objective, the UN has failed. Especially in the last 3 decades, you will notice that the UN has been very ineffective. It has been sidelined in case of any major conflict that you see in the world. The answer to this, the answer to why the UN has become toothless, lies in the structure of the United Nations. The very structure of the UN is outdated in today's world. It does not reflect the current geopolitical realities. And that is exactly been India's position as well. Now, India, which is pushing for UN reforms for many years, has pointed out the flawed structure of the UN and how it doesn't provide a representation for several major powers in today's multilateral world. That is one of the prime reasons why the UN fails in handling any conflict. The power has been largely concentrated in the hands of an elite club, which is the UN Security Council. If you look at the structure of the UN, there are 6 primary organs established through the UN Charter. You have your UN General Assembly, the UNGA. the UN Security Council, the UNSC, the Economic and Social Council or ECOSOC, responsible for all the welfare activities, all the social economic initiatives of the UN, including your sustainable development goals, climate change efforts, etc. The Trusteeship Council, which has ceased to exist right now because all the trusteeship territories that existed, which were former colonies, especially out of Germany, Italy and others, they've all transitioned towards self-rule and independence. So as the trusteeship territories don't exist anymore, the Trusteeship Council has stopped functioning. Then you have the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, to settle disputes between UN member states, and the UN Secretariat, which acts as the executive arm of the United Nations. But the primary decision-making power lies with the UN Security Council and partly with UN General Assembly. Now, if you look at UN General Assembly, look at the composition of UNGA, this is a universal body. Almost all the countries in the world, 193 member states of the world, they have adopted the UN Charter, which is legally binding as per international law, and they're all members of UN General Assembly, where every country enjoys an equal vote. All 193 member countries have an equal vote. Ideally, the power should have been vested with the UNGA. If you go by democratic principles, UNGA, which has universal representation and equal vote for everyone, should have been the highest decision-making body of the UN. But unfortunately, that is not the case. The UNGA has very limited powers because all the essential powers have been concentrated in the hands of an elite club, which is the UN Security Council. The UNSC, if you look at its composition, there are 15 members in the UNSC. 10 of them are non-permanent members who are elected for a 2-year term on a rotational basis. There is a geographical quota system through which 10 member countries are elected from around the world, from different regions, who act as non-permanent members for a 2-year term. But all the powers are concentrated in this elite club called the P5 or the Permanent 5. These are the 5 permanent members of the UNSC. The 5 permanent members enjoy the veto right, the power of veto, meaning they can veto any resolution. These 5 permanent members of UNSC, they largely control and dominate the United Nations, and all the roles of the UN is largely controlled by the P5. These 5 permanent members are the United States, Russia and China, and UK and France. So these 5 permanent members of UNSC have cornered all the powers to themselves. Back in 1945, maybe this structure made sense because these were the countries which could act as the representatives of the world. But over a period of time, the global order has changed. It's not just these 5 countries which have a key role in geopolitics. There are many other middle powers which have risen, from India to Brazil to Japan, Turkey, Indonesia, Germany, right? There are many middle powers which are playing a key role in geopolitics, but they have no representation at the UNSC. At the maximum, they can become non-permanent members, which is just a superficial role. Whereas all the key powers are concentrated in the hands of the P5, the 5 permanent members, and through their veto, they can control most of the functioning of the United Nations. Be it the United Nations intervention in case of conflicts, be it the powers of the UN to impose economic sanctions on a certain country, or even the aspect of UN where the UN deals with counter-terrorism, nuclear disarmament, all these key issues, including the deployment of UN peacekeeping forces in UN peacekeeping missions. All these critical decisions are left to the UNSC, which means the P5 countries have complete control over these critical decisions. Even the right to authorize the use of force, which is UN's approval to invade a particular country. If a particular country is threatening global security, the UN can authorize the use of force, essentially allowing an invasion through a coalition force. Such critical powers are vested only with UNSC, and these decisions are entirely controlled by the P5 countries, the 5 permanent members of the UNSC. Now, these 5 permanent members, they have largely misused the veto. They have largely misused the veto to serve their own geopolitical interests. They have all focused mainly on their respective national interests. So within the P5, a clear division has come up, where you have the Western countries aligned on one side, the US, UK and France, with their rivals on the other side, that is Russia and China. So within the P5, there is a division. There are like two power blocks which have come up, and they always use their votes to fulfill their respective geopolitical and national interests. Be it imposing economic sanctions or tackling terrorism or even preventing wars and conflicts. On all these key issues, these countries use the veto to serve their respective interests and not the interests of the world. The United Nations was supposed to serve a global good. As an international organization, as a multilateral body, its purpose was to serve a global good, to serve the good of the humanity. Whereas the powers being concentrated in the hands of few big powers has led them to misuse that power to serve their own self-interests. So, according to the former Indian diplomats, this is the prime reason why the UN has failed. Rakesh Sood and Vivek Kajju, they say that for an effective international global order, there are two criteria. If you want an effective global body to provide international order, there are two criteria which have to be met. One, there should be a convergence of views amongst the major powers of the day. The major powers, if you take into account the P5, there should be a convergence of views amongst them. And they should all have an objective to serve the global public good, not their own self-interests, not their own national interests, but the interests of the world, the interests of humanity. That is when an international order like the UN will be effective. But since the P5 countries have been misusing their veto and the UNSC for their own self-national interests, the very legitimacy of UN and the role and influence of UN has declined over the decades. This is all the more evident after the end of the Cold War. That is after 1991, after the Soviet Union collapsed. The United Nations has lost its relevance more rapidly because the power equations have changed. Power equations are not the same. During the Cold War, from 1945 to 1991, the world was a bipolar world where it was divided between two superpower blocks led by the US and Soviet Union. So as a result of this Cold War geopolitical rivalry between the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc, led by US and Soviet Union respectively, there was some sense of balance in international geopolitics, as one power bloc could be balanced out by the other. But with the collapse of Soviet Union, the disintegration of Soviet Union in 1991, we entered a unipolar world dominated by Western countries, particularly the United States. So, over the last 3 decades, you see that the Western countries led by US have used the UN the way they want to serve their respective national interests. So the frozen structure of the UN, especially the UNSC, the lack of representation at UNSC for other countries, for other powers which have risen, right? And the elite nature of the permanent club of UNSC is what contributes to the declining legitimacy and the very influence of the United Nations. Because after the Cold War ended, as Western countries gave rise to a unipolar world, they have largely acted unilaterally. US, UK, France and other European allies, right? They've largely acted the way they want in international geopolitics. They haven't bothered too much about the global public good, right? They've used their authority, their influence to serve their national interests. They've misused the veto, and as a result, the UN fails to be an effective body to deal with any such conflicts. Now, I can give you examples as well to justify this argument. Now, look at how the role of the UN has declined or it's been limited post 1991, especially from 91 to 2008, you see a significant decline in the legitimacy and the role of the United Nations, right? This is where a unipolar world existed, which was largely a US-led Western liberal order, right? Because until then, until early 2000, Russia, China weren't major challenges to the Western dominance. Russia, China, especially after 2008, have started posing a major challenge to the Western countries. And also we have several other middle powers which have come up. And today we have truly entered a multilateral world. That is after 2008. From 2008 to 2023, we are witnessing a multilateral world, a multipolar world, where multiple power centers exist. It's no longer just the Western countries which dominate. They are countered by Russia and China, and there are many middle powers which exert their own influence. But from 91 to 2008, during these 2 decades approximately, the Western countries led by US carried out several military interventions, many times without any involvement of the UN. If you look at the invasion of Afghanistan following the 9/11 attacks, this invasion was approved by the UNSC. The UNSC granted approval to target Al-Qaeda and Taliban, which were seen as a global threat. But apart from the permission given by UNSC authorizing the use of force in Afghanistan, other than that, UN's involvement in Afghanistan was very, very limited. The US and the Western countries, they did what they wanted, right? They conducted their operations the way they wanted to serve their national interests, not the global common good. Then came the misadventures in Iraq, the illegitimate war led by US and UK in Iraq under the pretext of fighting Saddam Hussein and his WMDs, or weapons of mass destruction, which never existed in the first place. Then came European intervention in Libya and North Africa, backed by the United States. Be it France or UK, they have conducted military interventions in Libya and North Africa with the support of the United States, without any bare involvement of the UN. The UN has been playing a minimal or zero role in these conflicts which have been seen across Africa and Asia. So Western countries misused their powers. They subverted the United Nations. They used their authority to conduct geopolitics the way they wanted, perpetuate wars and conflicts to serve their own interests. So by early 2000, the UN had already lost its legitimacy, and then came the global economic crisis, the recession of 2008-2009. This led to the stagnation of Western economies. Western economies started stagnating. They started seeing a decline in their growth and influence. We saw the parallel rise of Russia and China. China especially had emerged as a global power, an aspiring global power, along with several other middle powers including India, Japan, Germany, Brazil, even Turkey, Indonesia, and many, many others. Several middle powers had risen to power with the significant influence of Russia and China, and thus we entered a multilateral world, a multipolar world, without any multilateral body. Because the UN was no longer a truly multilateral organization. Even though it had universal representation, UNGA has no powers. All powers are concentrated in the hands of the UNSC, right? So this remains the major flaw of the United Nations. In the post-2008 world, the multipolar world that we are living in the last 15 years, the UN is extremely ineffective in handling any such global situations because the P5 countries continue to use the UNSC, their veto, to serve their own national interests. You saw even during the COVID-19 pandemic, right? The UN barely played a role in achieving any coordination between countries. Countries were busy blaming each other. We have seen during the latest conflicts, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Azerbaijan-Armenia conflict, even in case of the ongoing Israel-Hamas conflict, right? The humanitarian tragedy that Israel has unleashed in Gaza. In any of these cases, the UN has failed to achieve its stated objective. It has not been capable of intervening and promoting human rights or in handling disputes and conflicts. The primary reason is the outdated structure of the UN, and that is the reason why India has always pushed for UN reforms. India has even formed an informal club called the G4 that consists of India, Japan, Germany and Brazil. These four countries, which have become the middle powers in today's world, right? They are appealing for UN reforms for giving permanent membership to the G4 countries. So they could also play a bigger role in global geopolitics. So the problem is UN is not truly representative. It doesn't represent the multipolar world. A multipolar world needs a multilateral institution that has true global representation. But the UN is stuck in the World War era. That is the reason why you see this chaos, this frequent exercise of force by various dominating countries without caring about the consequences. They know that the UN cannot punish them. They know that UN cannot take action against them. Now recently, if you saw, the UN Secretary General criticized Israel for using disproportionate force targeting civilians. This is clearly against international law, against humanitarian law. But Israel dismissed the concern of the United Nations and even retaliated against the UN. So countries like Israel or Russia or even US, they get the courage to do that because they know that there will be no consequences. They know that they can misuse the UNSC, they can vote to protect their own interests, and thus leading to the failure of the global world order. Is that clear? So this is a very important argument that the two former Indian diplomats are bringing up. So it is an important topic for your mains. You can expect a mains question on why the UN has become ineffective, or why there is a need to reform the UN, which India also has been pushing for. So now let's move on to the next column. It's related to what we were discussing. It deals with the ongoing war in West Asia, the Israel-Hamas conflict. In this column, the writer Stanley Johnny examines the complex geopolitics of West Asia, and he points out how the problems of West Asia is eventually connected to the Palestinian question. The Israel-Palestine conflict remains at the very core of all the problems in West Asia region. That is the primary argument the writer is trying to make. See, on the 7th of October, we all saw how Hamas carried out a brutal, indiscriminate terror attack against innocent Israeli civilians. Hamas carried out this brutal attack, killing more than 1,400 Israeli civilians. Now, Israel has retaliated with brutal force, and in order to target Hamas, Israel has unleashed a complete terror targeting the whole of Gaza Strip, right? Including civilians, Palestinian civilians in Gaza. They are in the line of fire, they are being seen as collateral damage, right? And Israel has went on to bomb Gaza and even conduct ground operations, and more than 9,000 people are dead in Gaza already. And many of them are children. Almost 3,500 plus children have been killed in Gaza, and even in the Hamas terror attack, amongst the 1,400 Israelis who were killed, many of them were innocent children. So there has been complete disregard for humanitarian values from both the sides. Of course, the initial trigger came from Hamas, but the disproportionate use of force by Israel is also equally unjustifiable. And also, this is not a recent conflict. You can't just look at this from the 7th of October. There is a complex, deep-rooted history behind it. Right? The conflict here between Israel and the Palestinian outfits like Hamas has a deep-rooted history, a complex history involving the geopolitics of West Asia. Now, Israel has always justified its disproportionate force by saying that it faces an existential crisis. This is true to an extent. Now, if you look at the creation of Israel, which goes all the way back to 1948, where Israel violated the two-state plan, it broke the two-state solution that was brought out by the United Nations, and it went on to unilaterally declare independence. You can see here in the map, this was supposed to be the UN division plan, the two-state solution, where two countries were supposed to be born parallelly, simultaneously. A Jewish state called Israel and Palestine for the Palestinian Arabs. These were supposed to be the territories. But Israel went on to declare unilateral independence, and immediately the Arab states went to war against Israel. Of course, in the region, the Arab states which have backed the Palestinians, many of them have called for a complete wipeout of Israel. If you look at countries like Iran, for example, right, they've called for a complete extinction of Israel altogether. So Israel has faced an existential threat. That is true to an extent. But however, the dynamics have changed over a period of time. In 1948, the Arab countries, they did go to war with Israel to defend Palestine, to ensure that Palestinian rights were defended. Because it was Israel which had violated the two-state plan. With the help of UK and USA, the colonial imperialist interventions continued, and they backed Israel to declare unilateral independence and even gave tremendous military support to Israel to withstand any possible Arab counter-retaliation. So when the Arab countries went to war against Israel in 1948, led by Egypt, the then Transjordan, Syria and Lebanon, Israel did face an existential threat at that point. But today things are very different. Today Israel is a formidable power, in fact a hegemonic power of the region. It not only has a very strong economy and a formidable military force and intelligence agencies, it has tremendous global diplomatic support. The Western countries led by US and Europe have constantly backed Israel through latest technology and weapons, and Israel has been a formidable entity. Apart from the 1948 war, where Israel won the conflict, defeated the Arab powers, you can see how Israel went on to occupy Palestinian territory in direct breach of the UN plan. See, that's why I insist that historical wrongs cannot be corrected by making blunders in modern times. Now, creating a Jewish homeland in the middle of the Arab world without consulting the Arabs was a colonial blunder. Right? It was the British which encouraged the Zionist movement, the radical Zionist movement, to back some of the Jews to seek the formation of a Jewish homeland in the middle of the Arab region. The fact that the Jews were displaced thousands of years ago cannot be used as an excuse to create these homelands in areas which are inhabited by other communities in modern times. Now, to correct this mistake, the Palestinians, some of the radical Palestinian outfits with the backing of some of the Arab states in the region, they have gone on to commit several historical blunders seeking the very extinction of Israel. Right? In the last 70 years, that's what we have seen, where Israel has indeed faced an existential threat at the hands of terrorist outfits, right? Some of the Palestinian terror organizations with the backing of some of the Arab countries which have called for death of Israel. So, on either side, historical mistakes cannot be corrected with more blunders being committed. Now, if you look at Israel, the excuse it gives for using disproportionate force even against civilians is that it has to be brutal. It has to be showing a stronger image in order to stand up to the threat posed by the Arab countries in the region. While this is true to an extent in the context of the 1948 Arab-Israel war, after that, it has been Israel which has largely triggered conflicts. If you look at the 1956 war over Suez Canal, if you look at the 1967 Six-Day Arab War, these were wars triggered by Israel, not by the Arab countries. Through the wars of 1956 and 1967, Israel cemented its position in the region, went on to occupy the territory of other Arab countries as well, including the whole of West Bank. It gained full control over Gaza Strip and West Bank, including the Sinai region of Egypt, pushed back Jordan from West Bank and captured the Golan Heights of Syria. Even today, the Golan Heights of Syria remains under Israeli occupation. The Palestinian territories are under Israeli occupation. Now, if you look at the other instance where Israel has been threatened, it would be the 1973 Yom Kippur War. This was another instance where the Arab countries led by Egypt and Syria, they launched the war against Israel, a surprise attack against Israel. So if you're looking at Israel's justification for using disproportionate force, if Israel is saying to survive, we have to use brutal disproportionate force, there are two instances which can be seen as a justification. One is the 1948 Arab War and the 1973 Yom Kippur War. These are the two instances where Israel did face a direct threat from a coalition of Arab countries which were waging a war against the country. Of course, some of the countries have provided direct state support to some of the Palestinian terror groups as well. But other than that, it has been Israel on the other hand which has triggered conflicts and maintained tensions in the region. If you look at the Suez Crisis, the 1956 war, the Six-Day Arab War, it was Israel which was the instigator. Now, if you look at how Israel has went on to occupy Palestinian territories, if you see how Palestinian territories have been reduced, how their rights have been curbed, in a way, Israel has perpetuated the tensions, the conflict, despite securing its position in the region. Despite cementing its sovereignty and position, it has not stopped the subjugation of Palestinians, and this is what becomes the fuel for the terror groups to thrive and target Israel. For some of the countries like Iran to continue backing terrorist organizations like Hamas, Hezbollah, and another new Palestinian outfit called Islamic Jihad, these terror groups continue to enjoy support from countries like Iran, Qatar, even Syria and Lebanon, because it is Israel which has maintained the hostilities, the tensions, and it has never provided for the protection of Palestinian rights. Right? Israel has continued the occupation of the territories, pushed illegal Jewish settlements, used its massive military power to curb Palestinian rights and even blockade Gaza for decades together. Now, if you look at the rise of Hamas, it happens much later. If Israel is saying that disproportionate force has to be used to counter groups like Hamas, Hamas came into being only in 1988. Hamas became a brutal terror organization from late 90s and early 2000. But Israel's disproportionate use of force has existed even before that, from 1950s itself. Another excuse given by Israel is that Iran is a major threat. Iran is the one backing such groups, along with countries like Syria and others, creating an existential threat for Israel. If you look at this argument as well, Iran became a rival only in 1979 and afterwards. That is when the Iranian Revolution happened and radical Shia clerics took over Iran and declared death to Israel. Until then, Iran and Israel were close allies and close friends. Believe it or not, Israel even had an investment in a military project in Iran prior to 1979. Their military cooperation continued even in 1980s. It's only after that, as Iran became a more conservative radical regime under the Shia radical clerics, that is when Iran became an enemy of Israel. So even before that, Israel has continued the oppression of Palestinians. It took away the Palestinian right to form their own country. It has continued the subjugation of Palestinians and has continued to occupy the territories. Gradually over the years, even after Egypt made peace, Jordan made peace. Egypt and Jordan, they both made peace with Israel eventually. Through the Camp David Accords of 1979, Egypt made peace with Israel. It got back control of Sinai Desert in return for recognizing Israel and setting up ties with Israel. In 1993-94, Jordan signed a peace treaty, ended its war with Israel and gave recognition to Israel and set up ties with Israel. Despite the improving situation, right, and especially the Sunni powers of the region, led by Saudi Arabia and others, they had withdrawn their support from 1970s itself. From 1973 onwards, the major Sunni powers, be it Saudi Arabia, UAE, and the others, they had largely withdrawn their support to Palestinian outfits. They had struck a secret peace with US and Israel. So despite the improved security situation, Israel has not stopped using disproportionate force. This is a pattern the writer is pointing out. which leads to more atrocities in the region. Of course, he's not just blaming Israel for the entire crisis. There is the other side as well, but Israel's lack of recognition of Palestinian rights is at the very heart of the problem in West Asia. That is the key point the writer is trying to make. As I told you, Iran was not always an enemy of Israel. Prior to 1979, Iran was actually a close friend. So, what was the justification for Israel to violate Palestinian rights back then? What was the justification for Israel to use disproportionate force even in 1950s and 60s? So, it is this cycle of violence which has been created by both the sides, which has created this vicious cycle which perpetuates the volatility in the region and destabilizes the whole West Asia region. Now see, for a country like India, we have major interests over here. India has critical interests in West Asia. First of all, we have a very large diaspora population. More than 10 million Indians can be found across the Gulf countries, across the West Asian countries. Their safety, their well-being is critical for us. They send almost $50 billion in remittances back home to India, which is crucial for the Indian economy. These countries are very crucial for our energy security. Almost 60% of our energy supplies is coming from these countries, from Qatar to Saudi Arabia to UAE to Oman. Right? So India has to balance out its ties with these different rivaling powers in West Asia. On one hand, we have the challenge of balancing out the Shia-Sunni powers, where Saudi Arabia and Iran have an intense rivalry between them. So striking a balance between the Shia-Sunni powers is a challenge for India, whereas maintaining a balanced position on the Israel-Palestine conflict is another challenge for us. Right? India has to be mindful about the Gulf countries, what they think about India's position, because that could threaten the well-being of the Indian community and the energy supplies to India. At the same time, Israel has become a strategic partner, close defense military partner. Plus, we have a principled ideological support for Palestinian cause. Even till date, we support the two-state solution. Even though we support Israel's right to defend itself and act against terrorism, right? We have criticized Israel's disproportionate use of force quite often in the past. Even recently, in the UN vote which came up, we abstained from the vote, showing our middle approach or balanced approach towards the issue. Right? Even though India criticized the terror attack of Hamas and supported Israel's right to defend itself, we have urged Israel not to use disproportionate force targeting civilians. We have reiterated our support to Palestinian movement to create Palestine as an independent state, to ensure Palestinians get their right, their sovereign right to have their own country. So India has taken such a balanced position over a complex conflict. But of course, the current dynamics, they are entirely changing today. And all the volatility you see here, the most of the geopolitical tensions you see here, they all go back to the same root cause, which is the Israel-Palestine conflict. It all goes back to 1947, 1948. Now, the latest attack by Hamas has completely disrupted the new Middle East order that the US was building. The United States was trying to create a new order by trying to bring normalcy into the region through the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords were championed by then US President Donald Trump in 2020. Through the Abraham Accords, there were Arab countries like UAE and Bahrain, which had given recognition to Israel, and they recognized the existence of Israel and set up diplomatic ties with Israel. This made UAE and Bahrain the third, fourth Arab country in the region after Egypt and Jordan to recognize Israel and set up ties with Israel. So in a way, it was bringing normalcy back into the region, where these countries were largely moving away from their support to the Palestinian movement. Egypt has been hesitant to accept Palestinian refugees. Jordan withdrew all support to the Palestinian cause. The Sunni countries led by UAE and others also had withdrawn their support to the Palestinian cause long back. The Saudis had their own secret deal with Israel from many years, from 1970s. From 1970s itself, US, Israel, Saudis have aligned together. Essentially, the region was actually becoming more and more stable. And with Abraham Accords, with UAE and Bahrain recognizing Israel and setting up ties with Israel, things were changing. This was followed by other countries in the region like Sudan and Morocco, the African countries, which also recognized Israel as a follow-up to Abraham Accords, and they also set up ties with Israel. So just when things were normalizing, just when new corridors like the IMEC corridor was being proposed at the G20 summit, a very big initiative was announced, the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, that would connect India with Saudi Arabia, UAE, and further with Israel through Jordan, and further into Europe. So it meant a normalization was happening between Saudi Arabia and Israel. A normalization had already happened between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So West Asian geopolitics was headed towards normalcy for the first time in many decades. Now this normalcy has been disrupted again by the brutal terror attack carried out by Hamas and the disproportionate inhuman retaliation carried out by Israel, where even civilians have been targeted in large numbers. This cycle of violence, the vicious cycle of tensions and geopolitics here, which is all connected to the Israel-Palestine issue, is at the root of the problem for West Asia. Today, because of Israel's large-scale use of force, Bahrain and Jordan are looking to cut ties with Israel. This will be a massive setback. Bahrain has announced yesterday that it is recalling its ambassador to Israel who was recently appointed. After signing the Abraham Accords, Bahrain had recently set up its embassy in Israel and it had appointed an ambassador. Now it has recalled the ambassador and it has sent out the Israeli ambassador from Bahrain. Jordan, which had struck peace in 94, has also recalled its ambassador. It has downgraded the diplomatic ties, and these countries are on the verge of breaking diplomatic ties again. So the normalcy is going back and the hostility is coming back into the region. And that's what the writer is saying, that all the problems here in West Asia is largely tied to the Israel-Palestine question. Right? So that's why he's urging all the sides to display more rationality and maturity to bring a sense of normalcy back into the region. Is that clear? Now coming to the next article, the next column. The next article is important for environment and ecology. It talks about the importance of biosphere reserves. Because today, the 3rd of November, is being celebrated as the World Biosphere Reserve Day. This is the second anniversary of this celebration. It was designated last year in 2022. Last year, the UNESCO and various other bodies of the UN, they designated the 3rd of November as the World Biosphere Reserve Day to celebrate the role of biosphere reserves in environment conservation and human development. So today marks the second anniversary of World Biosphere Reserve Day, and that is why the writer is talking about the importance of biosphere reserves in conservation and in aiding human development. So let's understand what are biosphere reserves. What is the significance of biosphere reserves? What initiatives does India have as part of this global program, and how many biosphere reserves exist in India? See, biosphere reserves play a very important role not just in environment conservation, but they also play a big role in promoting sustainable development, especially in promoting livelihood development for local communities. The very concept of a biosphere reserve is built on the connection between man and environment. In fact, when this concept was launched, it was launched back in 1971, pushed by the UN. The Man and Biosphere Program was introduced by the UNESCO in 1971 to highlight the connections between man and nature. Humans depend on the environment, and environment also depends on human beings and human activities. So to build a synergy, a harmony between the human-environment relationship, Biosphere Reserve concept was introduced in conservation in 1971 by launching the Man and Biosphere Program, which was launched by UNESCO. Is that clear? So in a biosphere reserve, which is essentially a protected area, the focus is not just on protecting the environment. The focus is also on protecting livelihoods, protecting the local communities and encouraging local communities to play a role in conservation efforts. The symbiotic relationship between man and environment is encouraged and nurtured under the Biosphere Reserve Program. So such a protected area, which can be set up by countries, it has international recognition. All right, through UNESCO's Man and Biosphere program, there is international recognition for biosphere reserves, which focuses not just on conserving the flora and fauna. A biosphere reserve gets additional protection. It can get additional funds and expertise in conservation efforts to protect the biodiversity of the region, to protect the threatened species of plants, animals, birds, etc. Along with that, it focuses on promoting the traditional livelihoods of the tribal communities and forest-dwelling communities found in the forest areas. Biosphere reserves applies not just for terrestrial ecosystems, it will apply even for coastal ecosystems. Please note down this point, it's very, very important. The concept of a biosphere reserve, a protected area like a biosphere reserve, applies for both terrestrial and coastal ecosystems. So here the focus is not just on conserving the ecosystems, conserving the biodiversity, the plants and animals, but also on promoting the livelihoods, protecting the tribal rights, the forest dwelling rights, and ensuring that the local community, that is the man, plays an important role in conservation of the environment. And the environment in turn contributes to the well-being of the man in the region. It is this interlinkage that is promoted through the Man and Biosphere program. That's why it is named as the Man and Biosphere program, which was launched in 1971 by UNESCO. The goal is to promote a harmonious relationship between humans and nature. Is that clear? So the focus is here on building a sustainable balance to provide for development, to provide for sustaining traditional livelihoods without causing much damage to the ecosystems. It's about building that symbiotic relationship to create a sustainable balance between human activities and environment conservation. Because the tribal communities, the local forest dwelling communities, they do depend on forest resources. They will carry out basic agriculture in forest areas. They might rely on basic traditional hunting. They collect minor forest produce, which is essential for their livelihood. So while protecting these traditional livelihoods, it is important to ensure the locals play a role in conserving the forests. Usually tribal and forest dwelling communities, they've always worshipped nature. They play a critical role in forest conservation. So to further nurture this relationship between the local communities and the protected areas, right, the Man and Biosphere program was launched. So these areas called biosphere reserves, they have international recognition, and there is a unique model of conservation which is followed in biosphere reserves. There is a unique model of conservation followed in such protected areas. A strategy called a core buffer strategy is implemented. Once a biosphere reserve is set up by a government, by a country, according to the international standards established by UNESCO, the core buffer and transition areas have to be recognized, as you can see in this schematic over here. The core zone has to be clearly marked out, which is critical for environmental sustenance, to protect the ecosystems and the species and the genetic variation that exists. So in the core habitat, human activities have to be prohibited or restricted. Is that clear? Human activities will be strictly regulated. So several human habitations may have to be moved out of the core zone. If there are forest dwelling communities in the core zone over here, right, this is the core of the forest of a particular ecosystem. The local communities, if they're residing here, carrying out their economic activities here, it has to be prohibited or restricted and regulated. And if required, the communities have to be pushed out, maybe into the transition area over here. Around the core habitat, there should be a buffer zone meant mainly for research purposes, training, monitoring, education, where the conservation authorities, the forest authorities, will exercise control, limiting and restricting human activities again. In the buffer zone as well, human activities are limited. Is that clear? And finally, you have your transition area that forms the outer boundary of a biosphere reserve. This transition area is where the local communities are encouraged to continue their activities to support their livelihoods. This is where ecotourism is allowed. Basic exploitation of resources, including collection of minor forest produce, is allowed, along with agriculture and other traditional practices that are critical for the local communities. and local communities are encouraged to play a direct role in the conservation efforts of the core and buffer zones. This strategy, this model of conservation is called the core buffer strategy. You have a core central habitat where human activities are almost prohibited and restricted, a buffer zone around it for some limited human activities, and a transition area where the local communities are allowed to continue their livelihood activities while playing a role in conservation efforts. So this unique model of conservation is implemented in a biosphere reserve. Today, this program is a big success because according to UNESCO, there are 748 biosphere reserves in the world. Is that clear? Out of them, there are 18 biosphere reserves present in India. India has established 18 biosphere reserves and 12 of them are listed under the World Network of Biosphere Reserves as part of the Man and Biosphere Program of UNESCO. Under UNESCO's Man and Biosphere Program, 12 of the 18 biosphere reserves in India are listed under the World Network of Biosphere Reserves, which get international recognition and funding and assistance with regard to conservation efforts. Is that clear? So this directly benefits millions of people around the world. It not only builds sustainable livelihoods, but it allows the local communities to play a role in conservation and provides for protection of our critical ecosystems. So the Biosphere program has seen a lot of progress and success over the decades, and India is a major participant in this global program. Now I'm sharing the map which highlights the 18 biosphere reserves of India. I want you guys to be familiar with the location, and these are the 12 biosphere reserves out of the total 18 which are part of the UNESCO Man and Biosphere program, which are listed under the World Network of Biosphere Reserves. So please go through the list, identify the location in which state they are present. You have to identify the states they are present in, the important species that you can find in some of the biosphere reserves, and also find out which is the largest biosphere reserve and the smallest biosphere reserve of India, and mention that in the comments below. Let's see how many of you can get this right. Is that clear? So from prelims point of view, this is very, very important. Be aware of all the 18 biosphere reserves in India, which states they are located in, which important species can be found here, right? Any important geographical aspects regarding these biosphere reserves, you have to be familiar with that. So that is a small exercise I'm giving you, and these are the 12 out of these 18 which are part of the Man and Biosphere program. So read more about this, identify the largest and smallest biosphere reserves, and mention those details in the comment section below. Now this completes my detailed discussion of all the big articles. Now we head towards the prelim section where we take a quick look at the smaller articles in the newspaper today. On page number 1, the Hindu carries a disturbing image from the Delhi NCR region where air pollution has again hit alarming levels. The air quality index has once again dropped to the severe category. Now this has become a recurring feature in Delhi and around the Delhi NCR region. During every winter season from November to January, right? The Delhi NCR region witnesses very dangerous air quality levels, which is extremely harmful for human health. Now, it's not just Delhi, even other cities like Mumbai recently witnessed a very dangerous air quality level. But Delhi faces a persistent problem due to rampant vehicular emissions, industrial pollution, and also the stagnant wind currents that are present around Delhi during this time, which doesn't allow the particulate matter, the aerosols, to spread out. Rather, the particulate matter settles because the wind is largely still in the Delhi NCR region. This adds to the magnitude of the problem. But one major contributor here is the practice of stubble burning, where farmers in Punjab and Haryana that border the Delhi NCR region, they set these massive farm fires. You can see here how an entire farm has been set on fire to clear the stubble, to clear the agricultural post-harvest stubble which is left behind. Right? Farmers in Punjab and Haryana resort to this practice. The practice has been declared illegal. It's been outlawed. Governments have encouraged the farmers not to set fire to the stubble, and yet the practice continues. So stubble burning again has been noticed in large scale in the Punjab-Haryana belt. this will introduce a lot of particulate matter into the air, which gets transported towards the Delhi NCR region. Right? Along with vehicular pollution, industrial activity, the dust which is triggered by all construction demolition activity, it all adds up, it all accumulates, and in the still currents, the particulate matter will clearly deposit at the lower levels, causing very severe smog conditions, dangerous smog conditions where the air quality becomes hazardous and extremely dangerous. So we have an air quality index which is maintained by the Central Pollution Control Board that indicates the quality of the air that you're breathing, right? Different pollutants are tracked from the oxides of nitrogen to particulate matter 2.5 to particulate matter of size 10, the oxides of sulfur, carbon monoxide, all these essential pollutants, the 8 basic pollutants are tracked by the Central Pollution Control Board in real time and displays this as an index, the air quality index, right? It's a color coded index and the severity is also marked, whether the deterioration in air quality is severe, very severe. This is clearly highlighted by the Pollution Control Board. So this is extremely dangerous, especially for those with respiratory diseases, asthma, etc. For children, for old age people, and in general for human health, right? For respiratory health especially, even for your eyes, for your skin. This is extremely dangerous, hazardous conditions that exist. So to tackle the menace, in Delhi, there is a graded response action plan which is implemented. A graded response action plan, which is an emergency plan that is brought into action. It was approved by the Supreme Court of India in 2016. And under the graded response action plan, there are different stages under which certain measures are adopted. Emergency measures are adopted to immediately bring down pollution levels in the Delhi NCR region to try and improve the air quality. Now that Delhi's air quality has again dipped to the severe category, the Commission for the Air Quality Management, which is responsible for implementing the graded response action plan in Delhi, has ordered some emergency measures. Delhi has hit stage 3 right now. There are 4 stages in the graded response action plan. So right now Delhi has entered stage 3, which automatically triggers a set of emergency measures, such as a ban on vehicles which are BS3 petrol, BS4 diesel vehicles. This is to bring down vehicular emissions. So Bharat stage 3 petrol vehicles, Bharat stage 4 diesel vehicles cannot move around until the orders are lifted. Schools will be shut to protect children. All right? And construction, demolition activities and stone crushing and mining is prohibited until further notice. These are emergency measures which kick in once the air quality dips to a certain level. So here you can see the graded response action plan. It was recently upgraded as well in July 2023. It was upgraded by the Environment Ministry and the Pollution Control Board. So once the air quality reaches a certain threshold as given over here, these corresponding measures, emergency measures, are implemented by the Commission, the Commission for Air Quality Management in Delhi NCR region. So in stage 1, when air quality is just poor, if air quality index is between 201 to 300, few basic measures are implemented targeting old diesel and petrol vehicles. They are prohibited from moving around. Stage 2, it kicks in when the air quality becomes very poor in the range of 300 to 400 on the air quality index. So to combat pollution on an emergency footing, certain immediate measures are implemented, like diesel generators are regulated and few other economic activities are completely prohibited. Then comes stage 3, which Delhi is right now in, severe air quality. So petrol diesel vehicles with Bharat stage 3 and 4 certification, they are prohibited from moving around. Schools are suspended. Construction, demolition activities which are not necessary are completely stopped. Then comes the final stage, the severe plus category, where the air quality is below, if it's greater than 450. Right? This triggers a host of measures, including a suspension of certain industrial activities, thermal plants, and a ban on several vehicles. So this is the graded response action plan, where according to the threat level, a different response is implemented by the Commission for Air Quality Management. Next, we have a development from Telangana. In Telangana, with regard to the Kaleshwaram project, which is a major multi-purpose irrigation project over the Godavari river, a very adverse development has taken place. As part of this massive irrigation project, the Medigadda Barrage, which was being built, has sunk, raising fears about dam safety in India. According to this article on page 4, opposition leader Rahul Gandhi has visited the Kaleshwaram lift irrigation project in Telangana to examine the incident which has happened at Medigadda Barrage. These barrages, they are part of the Kaleshwaram irrigation project on the Godavari, right? It's a lift project which relies mainly on gravity itself to move the water through the canals and barrages and provide for irrigation in the region. This is where the Kaleshwaram project is located in Telangana. Alright? So it is in news because the Medigadda Barrage, which is a key component of the Kaleshwaram irrigation project, has sunk. 7 piers, 7 major columns of the barrage has sunk. You can see the piers here. Due to poor construction, poor design, right? These piers have sunk, posing a threat to dam safety and the very safety of the entire project. So you should know where it is located. It's also called the Lakshmi Barrage, right? It's a key component of the Kaleshwaram lift irrigation project in Telangana over the Godavari river. Next, on page 12, there is a mention of the India-US 2+2 dialogue. See, India and United States have established something called the 2+2 dialogue. A 2+2 dialogue in international relations refers to a format of diplomatic talks where the foreign minister and defense minister of both the countries engage in simultaneous talks. In the case of India-US, it would be India's foreign minister and defense minister meeting with the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense of the United States. So as per this arrangement, which was set up a few years ago, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken and the Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, they are going to visit Delhi next week for the next round of India-US 2+2 dialogue. This format is crucial because it provides an opportunity for India-US to discuss the important foreign policy issues and security issues that affect them and promote their strategic defense relations and foreign policy cooperation on several key matters. They're expected to talk about the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the Israel-Hamas conflict. They're expected to take forward the defense cooperation between India and US, where India is looking to finalize the procurement of the MQ-9B drones, which is in the last stage of finalization. So many such important defense, strategic and foreign policy issues will be discussed in a 2+2 dialogue, right? So this format has become a well-established format between India and US. It establishes India-US as close defense and strategic partners. So both foreign and defense ministers, the counterparts of both the sides, the 4 ministers come together to engage in a close dialogue to discuss the common concerns in foreign policy and in the national security issues that both countries are facing. In fact, we have similar 2+2 arrangement with other countries as well. Now find out which countries have a similar 2+2 ministerial dialogue with India. There are few other countries with whom we have set up a 2+2 ministerial dialogue at the level of cabinet ministers. Find out which those countries are and mention that in the comments below. Next, a small update from Russia. Russian President Putin has signed the bill revoking Russia's ratification to the CTBT, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Now, this is a topic which I had covered in detail just a few days back. You can go back and watch that video, which is available in the playlist, where we had discussed the CTBT in complete detail. Right? Russia had introduced a bill in the Russian parliament, the Dumas, to revoke Russia's ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which prohibits all forms of nuclear testing of nuclear weapons on land, underground, underwater, in the air, and also in outer space is completely prohibited. Testing of any kind of nuclear weapon in any medium, from outer space to underwater, in all mediums is prohibited under CTBT. But Russia, which had signed and ratified the treaty, now has brought out a bill, and the president has signed the bill as well into a law, which completes Russia's revocation of its ratification of the treaty. Russia is doing this because the United States, its arch rival, also has not ratified CTBT. The US is just a signatory. It has only signed CTBT, but it has not ratified it. Even China, right, and others, they have signed CTBT, but they have not ratified it. Whereas India, Pakistan, for example, and even North Korea, they have not signed CTBT at all, right? Because these countries have retained the option of testing nuclear weapons if required. So Russia also has downgraded its commitment to bring parity with the US, to establish parity with US. Given the geopolitical rivalries between them and how US has been supporting Ukraine in the ongoing war, and how US has targeted Russia with sanctions, Russia is escalating the tensions by bringing the nuclear issue onto the table. Right? This potentially allows Russia to go ahead and test nuclear weapons if required. And the fear is that this could trigger a fresh nuclear arms race between US and Russia. CTBT had played a key role, even though it has not come into force. CTBT is not in force because the required members have not signed and ratified it. Even though it is not in force, it had a moral weight, it had a moral impact, where countries had imposed a moratorium on their own testing. Except for North Korea, no country had tested weapons after 1998. Now the fear is that with Russia's revocation of its ratification, it triggers tensions between Russia and US with regard to nuclear testing. If either of them were to carry out a nuclear test, right, this could potentially trigger a new nuclear arms race that could affect global stability across the world, across regions. So this is something you should be aware of. So please go back and watch this video where I have covered CTBT in complete detail. Next, there is another shocking development in Myanmar, a neighboring country of India, where a civil war has been going on since the last 2 years. Since 2021, Myanmar's military has captured power by throwing out the elected government, and the military junta has been facing a resistance from various armed rebel groups. Myanmar also is affected by insurgency led by several organizations. And some of the insurgent groups, they had formed a coalition group called the Brotherhood Alliance in the northern Shan state over here towards the border with China. And 3 groups had come together, the Arakan Army, the Tang National Liberation Army, and Myanmar National Democratic Alliance Army. These 3 rebel groups, they fought against Myanmar's military junta, and they have captured this entire town of Chinshwehaw. It's a very important trade hub on the borders with China. This is China's Yunnan province. So on the China-Myanmar border, you have this important trading hub, trading town called Chinshwehaw, which is part of the Shan state. Now Myanmar has lost control over this region. This entire town has been captured by the rebels who call themselves the Brotherhood Alliance, who are fighting against the military occupation of the country. So from a prelims point of view, the name of the border town is important. UPSC might ask a question. Since rebels have captured this entire town on the China-Myanmar border, right, it does lead to further deterioration of situation in Myanmar. So whatever happens in our neighboring countries has a direct impact on India. So you should be familiar with such developments. So these rebel groups led by the Arakan Army and others who are part of the Brotherhood Alliance, they have captured an important trading border town called Chinchweha on the China-Myanmar border. Coming to the last article, India's Commerce and Industry Minister Piyush Goyal has criticized the carbon border adjustment mechanism of the European Union. The Minister for Commerce and Industry has said that the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism is unfair on the industry, especially the manufacturing industry. It could potentially hurt India's manufacturers who have major exports towards European Union. All right? So you should know what is this mechanism. What is the carbon border adjustment mechanism? This is essentially a carbon tax that the EU is levying on imports which are coming into European Union. Let's say the EU is importing steel from India. All right, let's say there is an auto manufacturer in European Union, right? To produce cars, they need steel and they procure steel from India, let's say, for example. Now, if this Indian manufacturer, steel manufacturer, if they have breached the carbon emission caps, if the steel manufacturer in India has not met the carbon emission standards of EU, then the EU will impose a tax on the import, which will make the import costlier. It will basically discourage European importers to not rely on countries and exporters who are not following the emission standards around the world. In a way, the EU will indirectly impose a carbon tax on other countries, even developing countries like India. So this could restrict Indian exports to EU. So that is why India has been concerned about this mechanism, the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And India has said this is a self-defeating carbon tax. According to the Commerce Minister, this tax will eventually hurt Europe itself. He has said that Europe's auto industry in particular will take a hit. This will be good for India in the long run. But in the short run, our manufacturers, especially our MSME industry, and some of the key export-oriented industries of India, which have a big market in Europe, they will take the hit because the imports could get affected, their products could become more expensive because of the carbon tax the EU is planning to levy on these products. Is that clear? So India has opposed it. India has said even we will be forced to levy our own carbon tax in the future, right? So India has been urging the EU to revisit this policy and to revoke the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So that is something you should be aware of with regard to economy and environment ecology. So this completes my detailed discussion of today's newspaper. Take up these two questions for your mains answer writing practice. Write the answers, post them in the answer writing portal, for which link has been provided in the description box below. Also join the Telegram channel, because as soon as the session ends, we have a quiz on these topics which will help you revise these articles. The link for the Telegram channel also is in the description box below. So this completes my discussion for today. I hope you guys liked it. Do let me know how it went. Press the like button, share your comments, and do subscribe to the channel. So that is it for today. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.